Israel assassinated Iran's supreme leader on the first day of the war, killing senior military, intelligence and political figures afterwards. For decades, assassination has been Israeli policy. But what has the strategy achieved, and is it becoming normalised? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Killing the leader of a country on day one might once have been seen as breaking the unwritten rules of war, if history is anything to go by. But that's exactly what Israel has done in Iran, assassinating Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and other senior figures this month. For decades, Israel has targeted people at home and abroad. Inside Israel, assassination by state agents is broadly viewed with pride. Western cinema and TV glamorize Israeli state-sponsored killing. Brave and cunning hitmen and women always get their target in the end. Allies rarely criticize the tactic. The US has applauded the attacks with no opposition from the UK and from the EU foreign policy chief. But what has Israel's policy of assassination achieved over the years? And is it becoming normalized with other countries following suit? We'll ask our guests in just a moment, but first this report from Alexandra Byers.
Israel and the US assassinated Iran's supreme leader alongside members of his family in the very first strikes of this war. Since then, they've killed military commanders, security chiefs, and political figures, making it clear that any senior figure is a target, including the new supreme leader.
I wouldn't issue life insurance policies on any of the leaders.
No one in Iran has immunity and everyone is in the crosshairs. We will continue to thwart and hunt them all.
Israel's policy of targeted assassinations dates back decades and stretches across the region. But in recent years, it's shifted into overdrive. In Lebanon, Israel killed Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah in a major attack in Beirut in 2024. His successor just a few days later. Then there's Hamas in Gaza. The group's political chief Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated in July 2024. The Israeli defense minister confirmed Israeli forces tracked him to the Iranian capital and planted a bomb that lay for weeks, waiting for his arrival. Yet those and other attacks on senior Palestinian leaders have failed to end armed resistance to Israeli occupation. Similarly, in Lebanon, Hezbollah fighters have redeployed to the southern border, battling Israeli troops, and the group has launched waves of missiles into Israel in recent weeks.
We've prepared ourselves for a long confrontation, and they will be surprised in the field. The enemy's threats do not frighten us, and the enemy will see our might.
Iran is also defiant. The foreign minister says the assassinations have no effect on his country's power structure.
We have not had anyone more important than the leader himself, and even the leader was martyred. Yet the system continued to work and immediately provided a replacement. If anyone else is martyred, it will be the same.
Israel has proved it can kill the individuals, but not the ideology. But with the policy intensifying, actively supported by the US and other allies, the question is whether Israel's tactic of state killing is now becoming normalized. Alexandra Byers, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss this further with our panel of guests on today's Inside Story. And joining us from Boston, Rami Khouri, a distinguished fellow at the American University of Beirut. In Haifa, Illan Pappe, an Israeli historian, author and chairperson of the Nakba Memorial Foundation. And in Swansea in Wales, Luca Trenta, an associate professor at Swansea University, who specialises in covert action and state-sponsored assassinations. Let me start with you, if I may, Rami. If we look at the way this war is being fought, you could say that it's a war, or one of the things you could say is it's a war by assassination. In fact, multiple assassinations.
Yes, you could say that, and it's because the Israelis have tried many, and the Americans, many different tactics in the various wars that they fought against various people in the region, and they haven't been able to achieve their political goals or their strategic goals. So they're relying more now, as we've seen in the Gaza genocide and what's happening in Lebanon, the West Bank, they're relying more on just savagery, destruction, creating wastelands of these areas, destroying civilian life, foundations, as a way to try to get their opponents, whether they're Iranians or Palestinians or Lebanese, to get them to surrender. But the Israelis, who are a very talented people, are totally blind to the realities in front of them, which is that when you subjugate people and threaten them and occupy them and kill them and ethnically cleanse them and starve them and freeze their babies to death, the people resist. They fight back. They don't give up. Just as historically the Jews have done many times in history. So yes, they're using these assassination techniques because they don't know what else to do, I think. And the other side is that the Palestinians and the Iranians have learned the lesson of this, and the Lebanese, and they've adjusted their situation, their security, their progression from one leadership to another, all their tactics and strategies, they've adjusted. And therefore you see that now with Hezbollah back in action and the Iranians still in action. So the Israelis have to really be a lot smarter in how they wage these wars and realize that the best weapon they have is to make a peace treaty.
Illan Pappe, you are one of Israel's best-known historians, so the right person to answer this question. I mean, this is a signature Israeli policy, is it not? Going back decades, either bombardment by the IDF, the Israeli military, or operations by the Secret Service Mossad. Israel has been assassinating people, and I'm careful to use that word because others, particularly Israel, likes targeted killings or precise operations. But assassination is the right word because they're not always targeted. In fact, we've seen it in the war in Iran. There are civilians dying each time too.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a long history of this policy of assassination going back to the 1940s, the first time that officially the Zionist leadership, that is in the pre-state period, was authorizing its agents, its troops, to target Palestinian leadership, not just military leadership, journalists, political leaders, was already then in 1946, believing then as they believe now, that if you target the elite, whether it's a political or cultural, social elite, you subjugate more easily the society as a whole to your plans of occupation, colonization, and so on. What is, of course, incredible is that since 1946, again and again, this assassination policy proved to be a total failure. It never achieved what it was declared to achieve, and yet there seems to be no process of learning in the Israeli policymakers, which makes you think that it's not anymore about really believing that it achieves anything in terms of defeating the enemy, so to speak. And it's much more for domestic consumption, trying to give kind of evidence of success in a war and wars that Israel has no chance in the world of succeeding.
And in this particular case, assassination seems to have determined the timing of the start of this whole war.
Yes, they do look for opportunities to kill leaders or leaderships, and that can, in a way, determine a more strategic decision to go to war, like we've seen in this particular war. But I do think, as you mentioned yourself, this is not always done within the context of war. Through clandestine and other kind of covert operation, this is all the time part of the method or methodology that Israel is using, trying to defeat ideas, the spirit of people, the wish to be liberated, not to live under occupation and ethnic cleansing, and lately genocide, and totally disregard for the fact that, as Rami rightly said, not only that it does not achieve the goal of defeating the spirit of those who are colonized or occupied, in many ways it creates in them the sense that there's no other way but to continue the resistance and the military and armed struggle, because Israel doesn't convey any message of peace or reconciliation through that policy of assassination and killing.
Luca, you are an expert in assassination. So tell me, I mean, for many years around the world, the idea of assassinating political leaders, particularly heads of state in a war, was seen as somewhat of a taboo, was it not?
Yes, there was a sense in which killing state leaders was somewhat different than other types of assassination. We said already that Israel has had a long history of assassination, of targeting terrorist leaders, suspected terrorists, at times even scientists working for some of the historical enemies of Israel. But heads of state were often considered somewhat of a different kettle of fish, something different altogether. Although this does not mean that states, including Israel and including the United States, have not tried in the past, but they try to do it either secretly, for example, as the United States did in the early Cold War, or in more recent times, for example, in the Second Cold War. They would try to do it by finding very stretched and at times implausible legal justifications to do so.
Rami, I mean, this is clearly illegal, is it not? Well, certainly the war is clearly illegal because it's a breach of the UN Charter. What about assassinating leaders like this? Because there's somewhat of a grey area, isn't there? The supreme leader of Iran in the Iranian constitution happens to be in command of all of the armed forces of Iran. Worth stating, the same applies to Donald Trump. He is the commander-in-chief of the United States.
Well, you could argue that. I think some people might try to argue that. But the reality, the bigger picture here is that as Israel has, and the pre-state Zionist movements, as Illan mentioned, and the pre-state ones killed British, they killed UN people, mediators, they killed Palestinian leaders, they killed cultural leaders, not just, fighters. The Israeli government, before embarking on this assassination campaign recently, they assassinated international law. They assassinated the mechanisms of global orderly life, of how people, states live with each other and how they have certain rights that they have to respect. The American-Israeli assault and the genocide especially has wiped that out, and very few people now feel they have to follow the law. They can do anything they want because they're going to be able to get away with it. The second point I'd make here is that the Israelis don't seem, and the Americans don't seem to grasp that the people they're fighting with, which is the Iranian government and people, the Lebanese Hezbollah, and the Palestinians, Hamas and others, they're all in a situation where they feel that they're in an existential battle for survival, that they have to fight or they are wiped off the map, and they will not allow themselves to be wiped off the map. They've been fighting for 100 years, and they're going to continue to do that. But the nature of their determination has shaped them now with the adjustments that they've all made to absorb the assassinations, absorb the destruction and all the cutting off of electricity and water and food. They've taken precautions because they have to keep resisting and causing pain to the other side to bring them at some point to a point where they end the war and try to resolve their differences in other ways. But the Israelis don't seem to want to resolve differences with Iranians and Palestinians and Lebanese peacefully. They want to impose their hegemonic superiority and control on the region. They want to be surrounded by vassals and supplicants only. And therefore, any approach that people try to use with the Israelis is going to crash on the Israeli determination to assert their priority and supremacy over everybody else in the region.
Illan, you heard Luca there tell us that this, for a time in history, killing leaders had become a taboo, but it's not been a taboo in Israel, is it? I mean, this is something that has sort of become glorified in Israel, and then that's been magnified by Hollywood, all the television programs and euphemisms of Israel, another euphemism, taking out people.
Yes, well, first of all, there is a difference, I think, between the current Israeli political elite and government and the previous ones. I think those of the 20th century were very careful to do these things far more clandestinely. And killing missions and assassinations were not that overt and clear. This particular messianic political elite that Israel has does not know any boundaries at all, and therefore it regards its right to kill and assassinate leaders as part of its more kind of general perspective of the period in history that we are living in, according to their understanding, which is a rare window in which you can recreate the greater Israel that they read about in the Bible, and on the way to reconstruct these or reenact the times of the glorious past. There is no inhibitions, definitely not international law, not human rights or civil rights, as we have seen in their actions in Gaza and now in the West Bank. But this is really something that is beyond kind of cold calculations of strategy and tactics. And we have to take very seriously that we are dealing now with the political elite with a messianic perspective, and therefore we should not expect them to respect laws of war or any other inhibitions that we thought that the international community somehow was able to produce after the Second World War, as far as military engagements between states and non-states organizations are concerned.
Luca, there used to be distaste in the US, as you've said, and a global taboo about the idea of assassination. In fact, there was even an executive order, first from President Gerald Ford, which in some form I think still exists, which says no employee of the US government shall engage in political assassination. But do you think that queasiness about this tactic disappeared after 9/11 in what they called the global war on terror?
I wouldn't necessarily think that 9/11 is a necessary turning point. I think US government efforts to circumvent or undermine the ban on assassination that you just mentioned already started in the 1980s under Reagan. And as early as 1986, the United States conducted, in collaboration with Israeli intelligence, an operation against Gaddafi's compound, a bombing of Gaddafi's compound, to try and kill him. This wasn't successful. But then again, in the 1990s, at the start of the Gulf War, they conducted a similar raid against Saddam Hussein. So assassination, even before 9/11, was part of the US arsenal, either as part of regime change or as part of broader conflicts. You're right, this has escalated after 9/11, when the United States joined with Israel into the so-called targeted killing game, in particular against terrorists. And I think we saw two further escalations, one under the first Trump administration, in which the infrastructure of targeted killings was used against a state official, Qasem Soleimani, in an attack in a third country. And then the Khamenei strike, I think, which is a further and perhaps the most dangerous escalation that has seen the successful targeting of a state official and a state leader in this case at the start of a war.
Rami, can I take you back to 1997? As you know, repeatedly Hamas leaders were killed by Israel, assassinated. Back in 1997 in Amman, Jordan, Khalid Mashal, leader of Hamas, was in Jordan, and Israeli agents disguised as Canadian tourists fired poison into his ear. He was dying in a coma. King Hussein, the then King of Jordan, went to Bill Clinton, the US president, said, you've got to do something. President Clinton then forced the then Israeli Prime Minister, one Benjamin Netanyahu, to provide the antidote. I mean, you think about that now and what the US is doing with Israel in Iran right now, it seems very different.
Yes, it does. And I was there, and I met Khalid Mash'al shortly after that when he recovered for an interview. And he was even more determined than ever to keep on doing the resistance, political and military and cultural resistance to Israel's occupation. So, I mean, it was striking to see him so vehement, so energetic, having such survived an assassination attempt. So that's the death doesn't scare these people very much. They're prepared for it. They're willing to risk it. But the American role, I think, was fascinating. But more important was King Hussein himself directly telling the Israelis that if they don't send the antidote to the poison, he's going to break the peace treaty. They'll end their relationship. So the actions of Arab leaders, I think, can have a role in this. But what we've seen in the last 30, 40 years is really the lack of sovereignty or determination or ability by Arab leaders and governments to act forcefully to confront Israel. And the two examples that have worked with Israel are the Egyptian and Jordanian peace treaties that created a permanent peace that has held despite popular opposition, because both sides, the Israelis and the Arab sides, got their legal rights. And the Israelis don't seem to want to do this. And the Americans are totally now giving Israel anything it wants to do. There's a little divergence between them on strategy and tactics in Iran, but probably not very much. And in the long run, this is what Netanyahu is counting on.
Illan, let me ask you about the strategy and the tactics and the aims of the Israelis and the US, because President Trump has given so many different aims for this war at various points. But one thing he said is that he'd like to find a Venezuelan model. Following his removal of Maduro, he effectively put the Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodriguez in power, keeping the system intact. How are you going to find an Iranian Delcy if you keep taking out all of the Iranian leadership one by one?
Well, I don't think it is a coherent strategy as far as Trump is concerned, or even as far as Israel is concerned in that sense. Namely, the way that the attacks on Iran unfold show you that the implications, for instance, to the petrol, gas, and oil economy were not at all taken into account. It was very clear that all this talk about regime change was a hollow talk because there was not really any plan or clear plan. What is the connection between bombing the Iranians to death and changing the regime? I think we shouldn't put too much behind these plans beyond tactics. Tactics to create, in the case of Israel, deterrence, a sense of invincibility after a very unsuccessful attempt to defeat both Hamas and Hezbollah in the last 2.5 years, a prime minister that wants a war in order to hopefully, from his perspective, to win the next elections, an American president that looks for distraction from his own domestic issues. It's terrible that these more petty considerations, together with what I called before the Israeli messianic ideology, are leading to that much of destruction. In many ways, you can say that the lack of any effect of the political assassination on the realities on the ground, namely on the determination of people under occupation to continue their resistance, very much like the assassination themselves, the whole war itself of the last 13 or 14 days is not going to change anything fundamentally in terms of the challenges that facing all those which are involved in the war, whether it's President Trump in his American domestic politics, whether it's Israel's relationship with the Palestinians and with Lebanon, and whether it's the Iranian people and their relationship with their regime. I mean, we are seeing all this firepower, all these expenses that go along with these military operations, and the damage and the inhumanity that goes with it. And we know it from the last round, which was just a few months ago, that the reality remains the same. And that's really worrying, because it means that there is something in the regional and international system that allows this kind of insanity, this kind of brutality to be repeated again and again in very short intervals. And this is something that really the international community should really consider, and not just the assassination themselves, but assassination are symptoms of the kind of policies that America and Israel are pursuing in the region, that is only aggravating existing predicaments and problems, and really threatens not only the stability of the Middle East, but of the international community as a whole.
Luca, very quickly, I mean, it is Israel, we think, that is carrying out most of these assassination operations. You've written a book, though, called The President's Kill List. Would you assume that President Trump is being consulted each time and told of the target list?
I think he was certainly consulted, and he was also very clear in suggesting that U.S. forces and intelligence had taken part in the raid against Khamenei. As other contributors have suggested, I think there is an emerging discrepancy here between perhaps Trump's wishful thinking or maybe willingness to do a deal along the Venezuela precedent and Israel's continuous campaign of decapitation that might be going against U.S. interest in a sense that it is eliminating leaders that the United States might be looking at as potential to make a deal. Just to be clear, I don't particularly think that such a deal would be particularly feasible, especially since all the war and the campaigns of assassination seem to actually have strengthened the regime, as the intelligence community had warned Trump that they would do. So I don't think he is probably consultant or given a green light for all Israeli operations, but he certainly was at the center of the start of the war and the strike against Khamenei.
Luca Trenta, Illan Pappe and Rami Khouri, thank you very much for joining us on Inside Story. Remember, for further extensive coverage of the war, with plenty of context and analysis, check out our website, aljazeera.com. We'd like to hear your thoughts too. Why not go to our Facebook page? That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or find us on X. There we are, at AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it from me, James Bays, and the Inside Story team. Stay tuned for the very latest coming up in just a moment.